slave, just like a caged bird. Those who are born or got their right taken and freedom in the palm of those who stand higher on the hierarchy. With this, it's difficult for them to fight back. Individually, they are weak, but when they join hands, it might be a little problematic. Even those who stand at the top might be a little concerned. In our history, slaves have risen up multiple times for their right and freedom. Out of all, a revolution at some relatively small island in the Caribbean Sea is the most successful one among them. And that revolution is the Hatian Revolution. So, as the name suggests, it took place in Haiti. Haiti, a country located on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean Sea. It occupied the western third of the island. Before, Haiti was not an independent nation. It was French colony under Saint-Domingue. It was the wealthiest colony in the world, and before it was independent, they were responsible for 60% of the coffee imported to Europe, and 40% of the sugar imported to Europe as well. So, a quick overview before we dive deeper into the event. The Haitian Revolution is a conflict between 1791 to 1804, which mainly involved Haitian slave colonists, army of British and French colonizers. The result of the revolution gained Haitians independence and became the first country founded by slaves. So what caused slaves to pull out such a grand performance? To no one's surprise, slaves were treated harshly by their owner, but that alone won't light up the fire. Haitian society had racism rooted deep in its core due to differences in culture and classes. Aside from Haitian slaves and the white European on the island, there were also affranchises, or basically people of mixed descent. Those affranchises, some were even rich or even slave owners themselves, but they still got discriminated against by the European, and thus affranchises joined the battles because they can't stand the discrimination. And then there's also the French Revolution. With that revolution, the French Revolution, slaves start to get even more movement inspired to rebel. Together, it eventually led to the Haitian Revolution. Before the revolution broke out, affranchises are in between the castes, between the whites and the slaves. They are also feared by the slaves themselves, but as already said before, they still got discriminated quite heavily from the European. Slaves were not treated well. Most are forced to work in plantation, usually a sugarcane, with back-breaking conditions. Some though escaped to the mountain and became known as Maroons, and fought guerrillas against the colonial militias. Guerrilla is basically a type of warfare where irregular soldiers fight on a small scale against the military.
So let's get into the timeline of the Haitian Revolution. First, we will expand a little bit about the beginnings of slavery in South America. In 1492, the Spanish began to enslave the Taino and Siboney people after Christopher Columbus spotted the Spanish island or La Isla Española. By the end of the 16th century, most of the people from this island perished under the invasion of European diseases, and slaves who were imported from other Caribbean islands suffered the same ending. This did not stop the Europeans from thinking that it was still a good idea to play around and use other human lives as free labor, however. As in 1665, the French took over from the Spanish and established permanent settlements in South America, and by the late 17th century, the number of slaves in Western Hispaniola increased substantially. Next, let's get into the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was inspired by the French Revolution that happened in France. In 1789, the eve of the French Revolution, Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as it used to be known, had a population of 556,000, of which there were 500,000 slaves from that number, or 87% of population. This did not mean that the remaining 56,000 were all white, as there were people who were mixed descent or free African people, or Afrancis as they were known, and they belonged in the middle class of the hierarchy in Saint Domingue. And this position in the middle can cause friction and discontent among them. And indeed, by the 1790s, the Afrancis became increasingly frustrated with the racist society and turmoil stirred within the colony, which was caused by the discontent, the French Revolution, and the wars between European powers. This caused an Afranci named Vincent Ogi to attempt rebellion, to which he was captured, tortured, and executed for trying to do so. Shortly after this, 1791, the French granted citizenship for wealthy Afrancis. This movement was opposed by the French colonizers in Saint-Domingue, which only further brought turmoil into the colony. Within 2 months after the French granted citizenship, thousands of slaves in Saint-Domingue rose in rebellion. The colonizers finally conceded to the law, wishing to placate the slaves, granting citizenships to all Afrancis, but this did not stop the rebellion. In 1793, the commissioner Leger Félicité Sontenax was sent to maintain order and offer freedom to slaves who joined his army. During this time, Toussaint Louverture, a previously enslaved man, became general who led an army and gained control of areas. He was not captured because he pledged allegiance to France while pursuing his own causes. He eventually conquered Santo Domingo in 1801 and declared himself leader, pushing free peasants back into the fields and encouraging French proprietors to return. With Louverture's rise in influence and France's waning one, Napoleon, dissatisfied with how his power was slipping from Saint-Domingue, sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to restore old regime and European rule. The French army clashed with Louverture's, which led to him signing an armistice, a peace agreement, basically, with France in May of 1802, but to nobody's surprise, the French broke the agreement and imprisoned Louverture in France. He later died in 1803. This betrayal of France led Louverture's lieutenants, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henry Christophe, to resume war in 1802, and many joined them because slavery was re-established in other places by the French. Much to their luck, yellow fever, which was the rampant disease of the time, struck Napoleon's forces, causing Leclerc to lose one-third of his forces to it. This weakened their forces greatly, especially with the stirring tension between France and Britain. On November 18, 1803, the indigenous army under Dessalines defeated the French decisively and ordered them to evacuate the land. And finally, on New Year's, January 1st, the entire island was declared independent. However, as they had just been declared free, there were a lot of problems that followed. Initially, Dessalines was the person who was crowned as emperor, who went on to draft constitutions for Haiti, but he was later overthrown and killed because of his cruel ways, such as his hatred for the whites, where he basically ordered the people under him to kill them for sport and stuff like that. A period of power struggle and civil war broke out for the following years, which Christophe, or King Henry I, won. He improved the economy, but at the cost that former slaves were forced to work on plantations again, which was no different to his predecessor's cruelty. He maintained his power for only 9 years before committing suicide.
As a result of the revolution, Haitian was again independent from France and became first country founded by slaves. This made European powers and their colony ostracize Haiti because they feared the spread of the slave revolt, two which later contributed to Haiti's future impoverishment. This revolution also stopped Napoleon's attempt to create the French Empire and led to the termination of the transatlantic slave trade. Merchants in free states want to trade with them rather than the European powers. But even though Haitian Revolution allowed them to become a country, but as slavery was a large part of the history of the people, they were extremely poor. Haitian Revolution allowed Haitians to gain independence, but the truth is not that easy. France only recognized their independence in 1825, but demanded a high independence tax that plagued Haiti for the next century also. This made population of the Haiti reduced by half and the economy in shambles. As for the long-term impacts, the Hatian Revolution made one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere due to the devastation of war, political instability, frequent military coups, and natural disaster, which causes economic instability as well as civil unrest. It also affected the surrounding country because of the lack of sugarcane, which led to the poverty and unstable government.
To summarize, the Haitian Revolution was started in the year between 1791 and 1804. The revolution was inspired by the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen that was opposed by the French. Led by Toussaint Louverture, who was formerly enslaved, the revolution was to overthrow and lead rebels against the slave owners and the French authorities. Louverture, however, was captured and killed in 1803. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of Louverture's generals and a former slave, eventually led the revolution to success. Declared the nation independent and renamed it Haiti in the year of 1804. This revolution terminated the Napoleon's attempt to create the French Empire and caused France to sell their holdings in North America to the United States, which expanded slavery into that area. It also made France and Britain fearful of enslaving Africans, and that ended the transatlantic slave trade. Their geography, government structure, and past mistakes led to the scarcity of Haiti as a whole, and they remain one of the poorest countries in that continent. Despite their long history as a modern-day country, Haiti still suffers from misrepresentation from the media, but it does not mean that they are not rich in culture and experience with a profound impact on the world as the world's first successful slave revolt.